Alright, some of the tools you're going to need to get to the forks and get them off. You basically need a bunch of Allens, and extended ones are more useful in this case, but you'll need a 3 for the actual fork itself, a 4, a 5, a 6, and an 8, all during the disassembly process to get the fork off. A 6mm ball-ended Allen helps tremendously when you get to the pinch bolts for the fork. Kind of specialty, more or less, tools, not specialty, but not something that everybody has. You need a 12mm Allen and a 14mm Allen to do this as well. 12mm socket, 10mm wrench, sorted ratchets, things of that nature. And then when I get to the actual fork disassembly, I'll show the tools needed. Okay, to work on the forks, you're obviously going to have to remove the front wheel and the front fender, but this is basically mirrored on both the left and right side. You're going to remove the reflector with a 10mm wrench. 2 caliper bolts are here, 8mm Allens, and then caliper will come off. I just zip tied it to here to suspend it, so there wasn't tension on the line, and I'm sorry, there's a 4mm Allen here. It acts as a guide to the brake line. It fits in a little notch back here. That has to be removed, obviously. Then from there, I think it's a 5 or a 6mm Allen times 4, 1, 2, and then 3, 4 on the other side for the front fender. That will come off. And then you would have to loosen the pinch bolt here that holds the axle. I would break the axle loose and then lift the front end in the air. How you do that is up to you. Just make sure you do it safely. This is a 12mm hex that holds, or excuse me, a 12mm Allen that holds the axle. So once you have it in the air, axle will come out, and then you can remove the front wheel. There are 2 collars, one on the left and one on the right. The bigger ring goes in toward the center of the wheel. Alright, so once you have the front wheel off, there's 4 bolts that hold on the front fender. I would imagine you probably have taken that off by now to get the front wheel off, but you have to take off the headlight assembly. So there's 2 Phillips head screws that secure it, as well as this electrical connection for the headlight. And then you have to move the cover off to get the forks out. So there's a couple things going on here. There's a hidden 4mm Allen in here, and to get it on and off, you kind of have to fish through these 2 wires here, but it's hidden from you. There's 2 5mm Allens here, and then your turn signal assembly will come free. And then you've got a 12mm and a 12mm hex back here for this plate, and 5mm Allens up top. And if you roll to the side, you have a, I think it's a 4mm Allen and a 4mm Allen. So 2 on the left and 2 on the right. And then you'll be able to move the cover in order to expose the 6mm Allen pinch bolts that hold the fork in place. But before you loosen that up, 27mm wrench up here to loosen the fork caps. They're on extremely tight, and then the spring stopper nut is underneath the fork cap and accessible after you move this. It is a 14mm Allen, and I highly recommend that you loosen that, not remove it, but loosen it prior to removing the fork. Otherwise it's going to be a heck of a fight trying to get it off with the fork off. Alright, so for the actual disassembly of the fork, you really don't need a whole lot once you get to this level, or this stage I should say. This fork is, I would say, an easy to medium rebuild compared to other ones. It's definitely not as complicated as dual chambered or anything like that, or a sport bike, and slightly more difficult than like a small 250, like Ninja or CBR 250 type of fork build. But anyway, special tool, a damper rod holder. I recently got these Bike Master ones, these little like pyramid looking things, and they work pretty well. I have a big one, and this is like the small medium one, and that's the size required to hold the damper rod while you spin the Allen bolt off the bottom. I believe it's a 6mm, the damper rod holder bolt. Small mallet, small screwdriver. You need a 3mm Allen to get the guide off. And then as for, you know, install, you need a metric measuring tape, or I guess you can use a standard one in inches. Fork oil extraction tool, grease, a fork seal driver, and blue Loctite for the Allen bolt on the bottom. Alright, so I'm going to begin the disassembly of the fork. This guide that I'm working on right now, it has to be an exact measurement per the manual. I think it's 281 millimeters or 281.3. So I'm recording it and making a mark on the tube just to compare now versus later and make sure the measurement stays consistent. 3 millimeter Allen for the clamp to get it off. Obviously it's metal on metal contact, so just take your time and use lube if it's not coming off the tube gently. Just kind of checking the tube here, taking this ring off the outer tube, and now I'm going to prepare to drain the oil. This is a very handy fork vise that I purchased. I think I'm going to end up doing a video on my teardown table so I can answer a lot of questions about it. But basically I'm going to tilt it and prepare to remove the stopper nut that hopefully you loosened earlier, because if you try to do it now it's just going to spin and it's going to be crappy. But just watch this, it's going to pop off. It's under spring pressure, so you have to be ready to catch it, otherwise it may fly across the garage. So there's your stopper nut. And the spring's ready to come out. This is going to get messy here. Note that it's a progressive spring. The tighter coils are at the bottom of the fork, so make sure you put it back in that way. And then I'm going to get ready to remove the damper rod assembly from the inner tube, loosen the bottom Allen bolt, and just get everything draining here. Obviously everything that I disassemble goes through my parts cleaner in the corner of the garage, just to make sure all the old oil and metal particles are removed from the components. But here's that special damper rod tool. I'm just using 3/8 extensions and a T-handle to hold it on the other end. And then I'm going to use an air impact 6 millimeter extended Allen to get the bolt off the bottom. And I had good luck with these. They popped right off without issue. So out comes the damper rod, and out comes the Allen bolt. The oil in these forks were, I would say, bad at an above average level. Definitely due for a rebuild. I mean, you can kind of see on the bolt alone like what's going on in there, and obviously there's some room for improvement. So I'm glad we're rebuilding these forks here. Lightly tap to remove the outer seal, the dust cover, the dust seal. Obviously you don't want to strike the stanchion or anything else for that matter. But off comes the dust seal, and at this point I'm going to remove the damper rod and spring. It's going to come out of the inner tube. Again, that's going to go over to the parts washer and get all cleaned up. And next, you can prepare to separate the inner and the outer tube. So your typical retaining clip, just kind of compress that in with a small screwdriver. That will pop off, and now they are ready to separate. So at this point, same strike hammer or slide hammer technique that's always used at this point. Just slow and consistent pressure. And then I'm going to lay out all the pieces so you can see the order they go back in. But basically, you have the oil seal on top, followed by a washer, flat side faces the seal, and then 2 bushings. That's the oil lock piece that just came out that is captured by the damper rod, like so. And it goes on the other side of the inner tube. You'll see what I mean on reassembly. So here we go. Here comes the oil seal, words and numbers up, washer, flat side faces the seal, small bushing, and big bushing or slide metal. Slotted screwdriver, 90-degree turn, and usually it will separate from the inner tube like so without an issue. All right, everything has been cleaned at this point. First thing I always like to do here is check spring free length. I try to get in the habit of always doing that first and comparing it to the spec in the manual so I don't forget. But bushings get oil, seals get grease. That's kind of how I always remember this. Or how I do it, I should say. But basically just going to go in the reverse order of disassembly. So, you probably heard my spiel on All Balls Racing stuff. Great products, great company. Greasing the seals here. It's really important that everything is clean before you start reassembling. Because as soon as you start putting components back together or pouring oil, if you have to go backward from there, you're going to like double the amount of work that you have to do. So just take your time the first time, clean everything. I mean, you see me wipe everything down like a million times while I do forks. It's just really important to treat it that way. You don't want any contaminants on your components. And as I said before, I have a parts washer. I'm lucky, but you don't need a parts washer to do this. big bushing, small bushing, washer, flat side faces of seal, Motion Pro bullet to protect the seal on the way in. Now we're going to join the tubes together. So you have to put the damper rod in the inner tube. And then once it's in the inner tube and at the bottom, you slide the oil lock piece around the bottom of the damper rod after you put it into the inner tube. The inner tube has to basically be between them, as you'll see here in a moment. I always put some grease on here just to make sure it's a smooth mating between the two pieces. Damper rod and spring. Always check the ring at the top of the damper rod, make sure it's smooth and complete. In goes that. Oil lock piece comes next, and then that assembly is going to insert into the outer tube, like so. Just be gentle here, be patient. If everything's clean, it should slide right in. But obviously, if you're forcing something at this point, something is wrong and you have to stop. Nothing should be forced at this point. So now we're going to lock the damper rod via the Allen bolt through the bottom. Again, this is just reverse of disassembly. Got my Bike Master special tool there with a bunch of extensions to hold it. We're going to throw some blue Loctite on the Allen bolt here in a moment, just to help retain the thread connection. And I'm just going to hit it a little bit with an impact as not to over torque it and make this job difficult for the next person who has to do it. The Loctite will do the job. I mean, there's no reason to go crazy here, which unfortunately a lot of people do based on the number of forks that I've disassembled. Make sure everything's clean, wipe it down. Again, you're seeing the advantage of a cool fork vise to have that's a fraction of the Motion Pro one. I really am a big fan of Motion Pro products, but I really could not justify 4 times the price of this vise when honestly it does exactly the same thing. I just built a little fluid catch at the bottom that rolls on rails, as you saw earlier in the video. But fork seal driving, again, hopefully this goes smooth for you. I always coat everything with grease just to help it out a little bit. This went on pretty easily. I think it was just 4 or 5 strikes here. Retaining ring goes back on in the channel. Make sure you hear it click into place. Verify it's in the channel because that is something that you do not want popping out. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge waste of time. All right, I'm going to protect the dust seal. Put that bad Johnny on. Sometimes you have to be patient with these. Sometimes they slide right on and sometimes they're a tight fit. This one is about the fit that you're supposed to have, in my opinion. Not too bad, not too loose. Again, make sure everything's clean. The way you measure fork oil level is the inner tube has to be fully compressed into the outer tube. Then you measure the air gap without the spring in it. So now the spring goes in, notice that it's progressive and the tighter wound coils went to the bottom of the fork. This is that guide that I pointed out had to be measured exactly per the Suzuki manual that I marked the tube for earlier and washed off in the parts washer, but you'll see me put in, the about area of where it needs to be, and then I'm going to measure my 281.3 millimeters probably 3 or 4 times to make sure it's good to go. Because the chrome guide on the table sits on top of this, and that the other end of it butts up to the top of the clamp back on the bike. So if it's not even, you're going to run into problems when you go to put it back on. This, of course, is under spring pressure, so have some patience here. Don't strip the threads or that's going to be a bad day. There is a torque spec on this. Torque it when it's back on the bike. If you try to torque it now, it's just going to spin on you. But very important not to strip these threads here. And then here's that guide that I was talking about. As I've done this more and more, and forks and power sports work, I've noticed that a lot of it is just like any other type of DIY work that you would do. The key aspects are doing your homework and preparing properly, so when you start doing the work, you end up getting the result that you want. If you realize that you're fighting something, or you feel like you're improvising or cutting corners, then something is probably wrong. And I think a lot of people lose patience or don't have the tools or the materials they need to complete a project from the beginning. And, then they get frustrated and run into all sorts of issues. So, as I always say, I would encourage you, have the right tools, have the right setup, do your homework, and just set up enough time out of your day to do whatever project it is that you want to do. But, if you follow those steps, it is very likely that you will be able to accomplish whatever it is that you want to do. And ultimately, it will probably save you a lot of money.